That night, Evelyn Brooks realized something terrifying about certain families. They don't throw you out with screaming. They do it over a quiet dinner. The smell of roasted chicken filled the small kitchen in Denver. Warm yellow light spilled across the expensive china Sandra only brought out during holidays. She had even opened the old bottle of wine she always claimed was for special occasions. The only problem was, nobody had told Evelyn what the occasion was. She had just walked through the back door after 10 exhausting hours at a medical logistics company. Melted snow still clung to her coat. Her shoulders ached from handling emergency calls all day. But what stopped her cold wasn't the table. It was Tyler. Her older brother sat there comfortably like he hadn't disappeared for years. Tyler smiled the moment he saw her, too soft, too friendly. The kind of smile people wear when they need something. Greg Palmer was there too. The man Sandra had met through her church group almost a year ago. He was pouring wine with the confidence of someone who already saw himself as part of the house. And in that moment, something cold slid down Evelyn's spine. Nobody said anything, but the entire room smelled like a decision that had already been made. Sandra told Evelyn to sit down. Her voice carried that fake gentleness that somehow felt worse than anger. The first 10 minutes passed in meaningless conversation. Tyler talked about his flight. Greg laughed too loudly at weak jokes. Sandra kept glancing at Evelyn like she was waiting for the perfect moment to cut something out of her life. Then Sandra slowly placed her fork down. The air froze. "Tyler is going to stay here for a while," she said. Evelyn nodded lightly. She was surprised but not angry. In fact, her mind had already started solving the problem. The office downstairs could become a bedroom for the kids. There was still storage space in the basement. She was still trying to make things work. Until Sandra said the next sentence. "I think it's time for you to move out by the weekend." Silence swallowed the room. Evelyn laughed automatically. A short, dry sound. "I thought you were joking." Sandra smiled too. But her eyes were ice cold. "I'm serious." Greg leaned back in his chair, took a slow sip of wine, and spoke calmly. "Maybe this is finally the push Evelyn needs to build a life of her own." Tyler said nothing. He simply kept cutting the meat on his plate, as if forcing his sister out of the house she had financially carried for years was just another small detail in the plan. And right there, something inside Evelyn cracked. 4 years earlier, after their father died unexpectedly, she had been the one who gave up her small apartment and moved back home. She paid the mortgage when Sandra stopped managing the bills. She repaired the leaking roof during the middle of winter. She sat for hours in emergency rooms after her mother collapsed from blood pressure medication complications. And Tyler? Where had Tyler been then? Nobody knew. He always disappeared whenever responsibility showed up. Yet, somehow, Sandra still looked at him like he was the child who needed saving, while Evelyn was treated like the daughter who was simply expected to sacrifice. She forced herself to stay calm. "I've been paying almost every bill in this house for years." Sandra's face hardened instantly. Then she said the sentence Evelyn would remember for the rest of her life. "You act like helping your family means you own this house." Evelyn stared at her mother for a long moment, and for the first time in her life, she realized there are people who can take everything from you while still seeing themselves as the victim. Greg chuckled softly. Sandra kept going, her voice growing sharper with every word. She said Tyler had 2 children who needed stability. She said Evelyn was old enough to take care of herself. And then she delivered the cruelest blow of all. "You've stayed here long enough." That sentence didn't just push Evelyn out of the house. It erased every sacrifice she had ever made. That night, Evelyn drove alone through the freezing Denver rain. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Her phone buzzed as she pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour convenience store. A text from Sandra lit up the screen. "We'll discuss moving logistics tomorrow." Logistics, not family, not love. Not the 4 years Evelyn traded away from her own life, just logistics. And in that moment, Evelyn finally understood the truth. She had never really been a daughter in that house. She was simply the person keeping everything from falling apart. That night, Evelyn didn't cry when she came back home, and somehow, that frightened her more than tears would have. Because the entire drive back from the convenience store parking lot to the old house in Denver, she had imagined herself collapsing the moment she walked through the front door. But standing there now, inside the dark, familiar hallway, the only thing left inside her wasn't heartbreak. It was clarity. The house was so quiet she could hear the ticking wall clock in the living room. Sandra had already gone to bed. Greg was probably back at his condo on the south side of the city. And Tyler was still at an airport hotel with his 2 children, completely unaware that his sister had just started seeing everything differently. Not as a daughter anymore, but as someone being removed. Evelyn walked slowly through the living room, and for the first time in years, she noticed all the small changes that had been happening for months. Her father's old reading chairs were gone. Part of the garage had been cleared out. There was an unusual amount of empty space near the shoe cabinet by the front door. The entire house looked exactly like a place preparing for someone new to move in, and her. She was being erased from it piece by piece. She stood outside her bedroom door for a long moment before opening it. Then her heart turned cold. Half the closet had already been emptied. 2 cardboard boxes sat against the wall with sticky notes written in Sandra's handwriting. Winter clothes. Donate later. Evelyn slowly set her bag down on the floor. For the first time that night, her hands started shaking. Not from anger, but from realizing her mother had planned this for a very long time. Sandra had not lost control during dinner. She had simply been completing the final step. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed. Streetlight filtered through the curtains, cutting the room into pale strips of shadow and light. And suddenly, all the memories began connecting themselves into one unbearable line. 3 weeks earlier, Sandra had casually asked whether Evelyn still needed the small office downstairs. A week after that, Greg kept mentioning how children needed stable space to grow up properly. Then the bunk beds arrived on Friday afternoon. Sandra claimed they were donations for the church. And Evelyn had believed her, not because she was naive, but because she had never imagined her own mother would plan her removal the way someone gets rid of old furniture. Her phone buzzed. A text from Nina Carter appeared on the screen. "You okay?" Evelyn stared at the message for several seconds before replying. "I think they planned this months ago." Nina called almost immediately. Her voice was sharp and calm, exactly as always. Nina was a civil attorney. They had known each other since college. She was also the only person who had repeatedly warned Evelyn that what was happening inside that house was not family love. It was emotional dependency. "You need to start saving everything," Nina said the second Evelyn finished explaining. "Every bill, every transfer, repair invoices, everything." Evelyn closed her eyes. She had never imagined there would come a day when she would need evidence just to prove her value to her own family. But that night, she opened her laptop, and the truth surfaced faster than she expected. The shared household account was still logged into the desktop computer downstairs. Evelyn opened the transaction history. A large withdrawal had been made 2 days earlier, money she had personally set aside for property taxes and emergency repairs. Right underneath it sat the receipt for bunk beds, then a new sofa, then delivery fees for children's furniture. Everything had already been arranged. Nobody had planned to ask her opinion. They were simply waiting for the right moment to remove her from the picture. But the real blow was hidden inside the unsent email folder. A long email thread between Sandra, Tyler, and Greg filled the screen. Tyler wrote that the kids were already exhausted from living in hotels and that he didn't want them exposed to tension during the move. Greg responded that it would probably be easier if Evelyn was at work when the children arrived. Then Sandra ended the thread with a sentence that made Evelyn stop breathing. "Once Evelyn leaves, maybe this house can finally feel peaceful again. Peaceful again." As if the woman paying the mortgage, fixing the roof, handling hospital visits, and carrying every bill for 4 years had somehow been the source of the chaos. Evelyn read the sentence 3 times. Then another memory crashed into her. 3 years earlier, she had turned down Daniel Harper's marriage proposal, not because she didn't love him, but because Sandra spent weeks crying after her husband's funeral, insisting she couldn't survive alone. Daniel had asked Evelyn one painful question before walking away. "Are you sure you want to sacrifice your entire future for this back then?" Evelyn thought she was choosing family. Now she understood the truth. She had only been teaching everyone around her that her life would always be the first thing sacrificed. Outside the window, snow fell heavier over the silent Denver streets. Evelyn sat motionless in front of the glowing laptop screen. Then slowly, quietly, she created a new folder on the desktop. She named it Records. And in that exact moment, Evelyn Brooks stopped trying to save her family. She started learning how to save herself. The next morning, Evelyn showed up at work like nothing had happened. She still answered emails, still sat through operations meetings, still calmly handled a delayed medical shipment stranded by a snowstorm in northern Colorado. Nobody looking at the woman behind that computer screen would have guessed her own family had spent months planning to push her out of the house. But underneath that calm exterior, something had completely changed. Evelyn was no longer trying to understand her mother's emotions. She had started looking at everything like a calculation. And for the first time in years, she stopped being the only person in the family operating from pure emotion. That afternoon, she met Nina Carter at a small cafe near the Denver courthouse. The sky hung low and gray above the city. Melted snow collected in dirty puddles along the sidewalks. The cold was so brutal most pedestrians walked with their heads down. Nina read through every printed email without saying a word, and the further she read, the colder her expression became. Finally, she placed the papers down on the table. "You know what's actually funny about all this?" Evelyn stayed silent. Nina leaned back slightly. "For years, they convinced you that you were just the daughter living in somebody else's house. But legally, you're practically the only reason that house still exists." Evelyn frowned lightly. Nina began explaining everything slowly. The mortgage transfers, the utility accounts, the repair invoices, the property tax records. Everything either carried Evelyn's name or came directly from her bank account. "Which means your mother can't simply throw you out because of one dinner conversation. And if necessary, you could absolutely demand reimbursement for years of financial contribution." Evelyn sat completely still, not because she cared about the money, but because for the first time in years, someone was looking at what she had done as something valuable. Not obligation, not duty. Value. Nina leaned closer across the table. "Listen to me. People like you think silence is maturity. Toxic people see silence as permission." The sentence hit Evelyn harder than she wanted to admit. Because it was true. Painfully true. That same afternoon, Evelyn started searching for a new apartment. The first one was far too expensive. The second smelled like mold and old carpet. The third sat above an aging bookstore in East Denver. The wooden stairs creaked loudly. The kitchen was so small 2 people could barely stand inside together. The lighting in the living room was terrible. But when the landlord opened the tiny balcony overlooking the snow-covered street below, Evelyn suddenly felt her throat tighten. Nobody here needed her to suffer in order to deserve love. Nobody here was waiting for her to rescue them. The apartment was small, but it was honest. And for the first time in years, Evelyn felt safe. She signed the lease that same afternoon. That night, Sandra continued acting as though everything had already been settled. She casually mentioned Tyler arriving over the weekend. Greg joked that the house was finally going to feel alive again. Evelyn simply nodded. The calmer she acted, the more they assumed she had accepted defeat. None of them knew that later that night, she quietly opened a brand new bank account, started transferring money, saved every document, printed every roof repair invoice, every utility payment, every hospital bill Sandra had once begged her to cover. She did everything in absolute silence. Like someone preparing for war, without letting the enemy realize she had finally woken up. Then something happened that destroyed the last remaining piece of sympathy Evelyn still carried for her family. Tyler called around 9 that evening. His voice sounded disturbingly casual. He explained that the kids needed more space, so maybe Evelyn could leave the old SUV behind for the family to use for a few months. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Tyler kept talking like the request was perfectly reasonable. I mean, you live alone anyway. And in that exact moment, Evelyn understood something with terrifying clarity. They did not see her as a daughter, or a sister, or even a human being with limits. To them, Evelyn was simply a utility system, and a resource designed to clean up the consequences of other people's failures. After the call ended, Evelyn stood alone in the garage for a long time. A thin layer of snow covered the SUV beneath the dim yellow light overhead. That same vehicle had driven Sandra to the hospital at 3 in the morning. It had carried roofing supplies after last winter's storm. It had crossed the city countless times just to keep that house functioning. And now Tyler talked about it the way someone asks to borrow a vacuum cleaner. Evelyn laughed softly, a small, cold laugh. Then she walked back inside, passing Sandra and Greg watching television in the living room. Neither of them looked up. Nobody asked whether she was okay. Nobody cared where she would go after the weekend. And in that moment, Evelyn Brooks finally stopped, hoping she would ever be loved properly inside that house. The woman walking upstairs that night was no longer heartbroken. She was preparing. On Friday morning, Sandra left the house unusually early. She stood by the front door in her familiar beige sweater, reminding Evelyn to clear out most of her things before Tyler arrived that afternoon. Her voice sounded gentle, too gentle, like she was discussing a few cardboard boxes instead of dismantling her daughter's entire life. Greg stood beside the car, holding a cup of hot coffee, looking unbearably satisfied. He didn't even bother hiding the victory in his eyes anymore. Evelyn simply nodded. No argument, no pleading, and that only convinced Sandra even more that everything was over. What she didn't realize was that the woman standing quietly in that kitchen had spent almost the entire night preparing for this exact day. The moment Sandra's SUV disappeared down the snow-covered street, Evelyn started moving. No panic, no emotion. That calmness was the frightening part. The black folder already sat on the dining table. Inside was everything Nina had told her to prepare: mortgage transfers, repair invoices, utility accounts, property tax records, proof of residency. Alongside it sat a legal notice written in the cold, precise language Sandra had never imagined her daughter would one day use against her. 10 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. The locksmith arrived exactly on time. He didn't ask many questions. He simply checked the residency documents and began replacing every exterior lock on the house. Evelyn stood by the window watching him work. The Denver sky looked gray as steel. Snow drifted slowly across the wooden fence in the yard. 4 years earlier, she had been the one who paid to install those locks after a failed break-in in the neighborhood. Sandra had cried in her arms that night and whispered she didn't know how she would survive without her. And now, those same hands were legally locking the house against the people who thought they could throw her away like unwanted furniture. Around noon, Nina and one of Evelyn's co-workers arrived to help move the last of her belongings into the new apartment. Nobody spoke much, because everyone understood this was no longer about moving out. This was the moment a woman finally stopped allowing people to treat her kindness like ownership. By 12 o'clock, Evelyn's old bedroom was almost completely empty. She stood silently in the middle of it for a long time. Cold light spilled across faded marks on the wall where family photos once hung. For years, Evelyn believed this room represented sacrifice. Now she understood the truth. It was simply the place where she had locked away her own life to make everyone else comfortable. Before leaving, she placed the old keys on the kitchen counter, right beside the legal folder. On top sat a short handwritten note. "If I was good enough to keep this house alive, then I'm good enough to be treated fairly under the law." Then she walked away, without looking back. At exactly 1:17 that afternoon, Evelyn's phone started vibrating. The first call came from Sandra, the second from Tyler, then Greg, then Sandra again. Messages poured in like collective panic. Why aren't the keys working? Where are you? What did you do? Tyler even left an angry voicemail, shouting that the kids were standing outside in the cold, calling Evelyn insane, demanding to know how she thought she had the right to do this, the right. That phrase made Evelyn laugh quietly inside her tiny new apartment. For years they had used her money, her time, her youth. And somehow, the only person who was never supposed to have rights was Evelyn. Around 3 that afternoon, she drove back to the old house. Not out of pity, but because she wanted to witness the exact moment reality finally reached them. She saw the chaos before she even turned onto the street. Tyler paced beside a pile of suitcases. The two children sat huddled together on the front steps. Greg kept jamming the key into the new lock as if anger alone could force the door open. Sandra stood frozen in the yard, her face completely pale. Across the street, two neighbors pretended to trim bushes while openly staring at the scene unfolding in front of them. The moment Evelyn stepped out of the car, Sandra turned sharply toward her. Shock flooded her face. Naomi. She stopped herself, almost unable to process what she was seeing. Then her voice cracked. What did you do? Evelyn closed the car door gently behind her. Cold air swept through the silent street, and for the first time in years, she looked at her mother without guilt. I protected myself legally. That's all. Tyler stormed toward her. He accused Evelyn of destroying the family. Said the children didn't deserve this. Evelyn stared at her brother for a long moment, then answered calmly. This family wasn't destroyed today. It was destroyed the moment all of you decided to sacrifice one person was easier than fixing another person's irresponsibility. Greg tried to interrupt, but Evelyn cut him off immediately. You don't get to lecture me about legal rights inside a house I financially carried for years. Greg fell silent instantly. Sandra's voice began trembling. She insisted this was still her house. Evelyn nodded softly. Yes. But for 4 years, you were perfectly happy letting me act like the homeowner every time the mortgage was due. Silence swallowed the entire yard. And in that moment, Sandra Brooks finally understood something she had never prepared herself for. The daughter she believed would quietly endure anything no longer feared losing her family. And that was the exact moment Sandra lost control over Evelyn forever. 6 months after leaving that house, Evelyn Brooks slept peacefully for the first time in years. No more doors slamming shut in the middle of the night. No more unexpected bills shoved under her bedroom door. No more waking up every morning wondering who would fall apart if she stopped carrying everyone else's weight. The apartment above the old bookstore still had a heating system that made strange noises every night. The kitchen was still so small, Evelyn had to turn sideways just to open the oven properly. But the place was peaceful, the kind of peace she never realized she had been starving for. Denver mornings became slower as winter faded away. Pale sunlight filtered through the tiny living room window. Evelyn often sat there with her laptop, drinking coffee while working with the first clients of her small business. She had started helping divorced women manage personal finances. At first, it was only a few weekend consultations. Then gradually, more women started reaching out. Some cried when they realized they were not useless the way their ex-husbands had convinced them they were. Others trembled while opening the very first bank account entirely in their own name. And every time Evelyn looked at them, she saw pieces of the woman she used to be. A capable woman taught to believe sacrifice was the price of love. Nina once told her that after moving out, Evelyn looked 10 years younger. At first, she assumed Nina was exaggerating. Then one morning, while getting ready for work, Evelyn caught her reflection in the mirror and froze. The dark circles beneath her eyes were gone. Her shoulders no longer looked tense. Even her smile felt natural again. For the first time in years, she looked like someone living her own life instead of someone desperately trying to prevent everybody else's collapse. Meanwhile, The old house on Alderwood Street began showing cracks almost immediately after Evelyn disappeared from the system, holding it together. Tyler lasted less than 2 months at his new job before quitting after an argument with his manager. Greg started visiting less often. He had loved pretending to be the man in control, back when Evelyn was still paying utilities on time and keeping the entire household functioning smoothly. But reality became far less comfortable once Sandra had to manage life alone with 2 energetic children and a nearly 40-year-old son who still behaved like a teenager. Arguments became constant. Food costs increased. Bills piled up. The water heater broke down early in the spring. Tyler claimed he didn't have the money to fix it. Sandra ended up borrowing from her retirement savings. And for the first time in years, she began feeling the weight Evelyn's had silently carried every single day. Then one Tuesday afternoon, Evelyn unexpectedly ran into Sandra at a grocery store near downtown Denver. The moment she saw her mother standing near the pharmacy counter, she almost didn't recognize her. Sandra looked thinner. Exhaustion had carved itself into her face. More silver strands now showed through the hair she once kept perfectly styled. The 2 women stood facing each other beneath the cold white pharmacy lights. Sandra spoke first. "How have you been?" Evelyn answered honestly. "I'm doing well. Work's been good." Sandra nodded slowly. Then she said something Evelyn never thought she would hear. "I saw your business card at the bakery near the church." She paused for a few seconds. "Your father would probably be proud to see you building something of your own." The words hit Evelyn with a quiet ache, not because she still needed the approval, but because she realized she had spent so many years of her life waiting to hear something like that. Sandra looked at her daughter for a long moment. And for the first time, the certainty was gone from her eyes. Only one painful truth remained. The daughter she once treated as permanent had truly stepped beyond her control. Then suddenly, a child's voice echoed down the aisle, "Aunt Evelyn." Evelyn turned around. It was Sophie, Tyler's oldest daughter. The little girl ran toward her with a backpack hanging from one shoulder and wrapped her arms around Evelyn instinctively, like a child recognizing the safest person in the room. Then Sophie said something that made Sandra go completely still. "I missed you. You were the only person who always knew how to fix things when everything got messy." Silence fell heavily across the pharmacy section. Sandra lowered her eyes almost immediately, as if she physically could not bear hearing a child speak the truth she had spent years denying. Evelyn looked at her mother, and for the first time she no longer felt anger, only sadness. Because some people only realize the value of peace after the person creating it has already walked away forever. That evening, Evelyn did not return to the old house. She drove back to her small apartment while the Denver sun painted the rooftops gold and orange. Inside the tiny kitchen, she leaned quietly against the counter and took a slow breath. And finally understood something important. Healing is not forgetting what people did to you. Healing is refusing to abandon yourself just to keep saving people who never truly wanted to change. 1 year after leaving the house on Alderwood Street, Evelyn Brooks no longer measured time by what she had lost. She measured it by the things she no longer tolerated. No more apologizing for needing rest. No more guilt for saying no. No more turning herself into a life raft for people drowning in problems they refused to fix. Denver evenings carried a quietness unlike anywhere else. City lights reflected softly against fogged apartment windows. Inside the small apartment above the old bookstore, Evelyn sat at a wooden desk beside the window, her laptop glowing warmly in the dim room. A list of new clients filled the screen. Divorced women. A single mother escaping a controlling marriage. A 50-year-old woman who had never owned a bank account in her own name. Different stories, but all carrying the same wound. They had been taught to sacrifice themselves to keep everyone else comfortable. Evelyn understood that feeling too well. Sometimes, on snowy nights when the city disappeared beneath white silence, she still thought about Sandra. Not with anger anymore, but with the quiet sadness reserved for someone who had lived inside a broken system for so long she could no longer recognize the difference between love and control. Sandra had truly believed the strongest daughter in the house would always stay, no matter how badly she was treated. That had been her greatest mistake. Evelyn's phone vibrated softly on the table. A new message appeared. From Sandra. Hope you're doing well. That was all. No apology, no explanation, no attempt to pull her back into the chaos. Evelyn stared at the message for a long moment. A year earlier, she probably would have answered immediately. She would have worried whether her mother was okay, whether Tyler had caused another disaster, whether the house was falling apart again. But tonight, for the first time in her life, Evelyn was no longer living inside other people's emergencies. She placed the phone back down, not out of hatred, but because she had finally learned something important. Forgiveness does not mean returning to the place that broke you. Outside the window, snow drifted slowly across the glowing streets below. Evelyn stood up and walked into the tiny kitchen to make more tea. The quiet sound of boiling water filled the peaceful apartment. Some people would rehear her story and call it revenge, but it wasn't. The greatest revenge Evelyn ever achieved was not changing the locks, not the legal paperwork, not even the moment Sandra realized she had lost control over her daughter forever. It was the fact that Evelyn had finally built a life that no longer revolved around rescuing other people. And that was the part that terrified them the most. Because toxic families survive by depending on one person willing to carry everything. The moment that person walks away, the entire system begins exposing the chaos that existed from the beginning. Evelyn understood that now, and she understood something else too. Kind people are often taught to stay quiet to keep the peace, to sacrifice in order to prove love, to endure pain in order to be considered good. But nobody teaches them that sometimes boundaries are actually the highest form of maturity, that keeping records does not make you cruel, that protecting your finances does not make you selfish, that self-respect is not betrayal, it is survival. Evelyn carried her tea back to the window. City lights reflected softly in her calm eyes. 1 year earlier, that same woman had sat inside a car beneath freezing rain, wondering why sacrificing everything was still not enough to be loved. Now she finally had the answer. Because real love never asks you to disappear just to make someone else comfortable. And a person's worth is not measured by how much pain they can survive for others. It is measured by the moment they choose to protect their own future. The phone remained untouched on the table beside Sandra's unanswered message. Evelyn smiled softly. Then she turned back toward her laptop and continued working inside the warm glow of her small apartment. For the first time in many years, her life was no longer a story about surviving a toxic family. It had become the story of a woman who finally learned how to choose herself. And maybe that was the most powerful victory of all. If you've ever felt invisible inside your own family, or carried responsibilities for people who never truly appreciated you, share your story in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay for more dramatic storytelling about betrayal, healing, and finding your true worth again. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and whether you've ever had to walk away from people who only valued your sacrifice, not your presence. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stop carrying the weight of everyone else's choices. And if you enjoy emotional family drama stories, powerful revenge arcs, and inspiring journeys about rebuilding life after betrayal, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Because some endings are not about revenge. They're about finally choosing yourself.